Romanticism has for so long been represented by the work of six great writers, all of them educated men from the upper classes, all of whom had financial support, and all of them poets. The writings of Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, Shelley, and Byron defined an entire literary period. But they were not the only writers of their time, and maybe they weren't even the best ones, just the remembered ones. When you let only six writers speak for an entire period, or for that matter, an entire nation, think of how many voices are silenced. The narrowness with which we've defined English Romanticism produced a vocal backlash. People get rightfully angry about being silenced, and so the process of unsilencing can be contentious and dramatic. As scholars have revised Romanticism, they've turned to underrepresented writers and underrepresented genres, giving a voice to those literatures. This week we'll look at the writings of women writers, sometimes referred to as bluestockings or women of letters. We'll read poetry by Anna Letitia Barbauld and Felicia Hemans, two female writers with very different careers. This is Anna Letitia Barbauld, born Anna Letitia Aiken. She came from a well-educated literary family. Her father was a schoolmaster, her brother a surgeon and a poet, and with her brother she co-authored a volume of poetry in 1773. When she married, Barbauld and her husband founded a school for boys. Much of her poetry and writings are didactic, not just writing conduct manuals for girls, but also written experiments in how to speak to and discipline boys. She was not an advocate of corporal punishment, so her school took a softer touch than others. She wrote a lot of children's literature, but also wrote highly political poetry. She opposed the French Revolution, opposed slavery, and was a dissenter. The term dissenter in this period of English history means simply that she was a Christian who was not a member of the Anglican Church. Here's the relevant definition from the OED. Quote, one who separates himself from the communion of the established Church of England or, in Scotland, of Scotland. In early use, including Roman Catholics, but now usually restricted to those legally styled Protestant dissenters. Now, just in case the history of the Church of England is foreign to you, recall that under the Church of England, the monarch is both head of church and head of state. So dissenters were those Christians who did not recognize the monarch as their supreme religious leader. Barbauld was faced with a few key conflicts in her life. The first was a moral quandary in 1793 when the British government asked individuals to fast in support of the war. As a dissenter, this left her with quite a conundrum. Should she fast, which was a religious act, while still opposing the war? After all, the fast wouldn't mean anything to her because she didn't view the king as her religious leader. Or should she not fast because she was not in support, but then possibly face some consequences from her government? Alternately, should she just lie and fast anyway and say that she supported the war just to avoid conflict entirely? This whole problem prompted her to write a famous sermon, Sins of Government, Sins of the Nation. And here I've provided a quotation from her discussion of national religion. This passage demonstrates just how seriously she takes the issue of having a belief and sticking by it. You will probably assert that most nations have a national religion, but by a national religion, I do not mean the burning of a few wretches twice or thrice in a year in honor of God, nor yet the exacting subscription to some obscure tenets believed by few and understood by none, nor yet the investing a certain order of men, dressed in a particular habit, with civil privileges and secular emolument. By national religion I understand the extending to those affairs in which we act in common, and as a body that regard to religion by which, when we act singly, we all profess to be guided. The second conflict Barbauld faced was when critics panned her work, 1811. This was a poem that criticized Britain's role in the Napoleonic Wars. The reviews of this poem were harsh, and you can see in these lines why. And think'st thou Britain still to sit at ease, an island queen amidst thy subject seas, while the vexed billows in their distant roar but soothe thy slumbers, and but kiss thy shore? The problem is that she sounds sanctimonious and anti-Briton at once. That's pretty easy to see. But Barbauld was so stunned to receive such strong negative criticism that she actually never published again. Whereas most of the Romantic poets began as liberals and trended gradually conservative, Barbauld was a steadfast liberal until the end. As other writers, her contemporaries, turned against her, she did not abandon her positions, but instead abandoned writing altogether. Barbauld was a career that inspired many, including a poetess and essayist by the name of Hannah More, who was most famous for her didactic poetry. But it was Barbauld who inspired that didactic framework, and again Barbauld who inspired Wordsworth in poems like We Are Seven and Anecdote for Fathers. Now, this week, we'll also read poetry by Felicia Hemans. Hemans comes from the second generation of female Romantic poets and had a very different sort of career. She has been frequently likened to Lord Byron. Just like Byron, she had a persona and wrote crowd-pleasing poetry. Hemans made her living by writing and by capitalizing on a trend of publishing poems in nice little gift books that were called literary annuals. This slide shows the cover of the Forget-Me-Not, which was the first literary annual. It was first published by Rudolf Ackermann in 1823 and was published every year until 1847. What Ackermann figured out was that every year around the Christmas holidays, you could sell a little collection of poetry and drawings that people would be delighted to give and receive as gifts. There are two truths about the annuals. First, people loved collecting them, and an annual publication of very pretty, identically bound books made wonderful showpieces on people's shelves. Second, nobody read them, so it didn't matter what was in them. In these books, there were poems by famous authors, often very bad poems, as they were written on commission and for nothing other than the famous name. Eventually, the poems were edged out by the drawings. See, I meant it when I said nobody read them. But someone did have to write the poems in the annuals, and they were written often by female poets, who sometimes put their names on their poems and sometimes left them anonymous. When you would find a short poem by a big name like Wordsworth or Coleridge, it just meant that they were feeling a bit cash-strapped and felt like taking an enormous sum of money to write off a few lines of utter crap. Felicia Hemans wrote a lot of gift book poetry, and she sustained her family from those earnings, raising her 5 sons after being deserted by her husband. Hemans wrote poems that idealized domestic life and glorified the role of women in the household. Ironic, given that her own household had been painfully fractured. The trend of women supporting large families by writing, that's a popular one. An unstable household meant that the female writers were profit-minded, and that the genres in which they wrote were chosen with profitability in mind. Drama was a popular choice, and so was the short and over-emotional style of poetry found published in the annuals. But these women also wrote poetry that was fiercely political, attempting to right wrongs, lobbying for equality among the sexes, races, and nations. They strongly influenced the famous male writers of the period, and that influence should be remembered. They were not the proponents of a romantic style of poetry. They were its progenitors. I'm going to leave you now with a short quote from Professor Emeritus Stuart Curran of our own English department here at Penn, who wittily described the influence of the female writers when he wrote, quote, "The suspicion would not die that the real language of men was the language of women."